So we've heard a bit about the background of our operation. It was a mixed farm that's been in the family since 1909, and my grandparents ran it as it's 200 acres altogether. My grandparents ran it, my great-grandfather operated it, my dad used to run a few cattle. We used to milk 20 odd cows, we used to raise 20 or 30 sheep. He had a few pigs, always had a few chooks, grew a few veggies, grew a bit of wheat, some oats, and it was a typical sort of mixed farm for the district, and it still is a mixed farm. We've just changed the name now, it's called permaculture. But it's a 200-acre block. It's pretty well flat. It's on the edge of a big volcanic hill, Kangaroo Hills, so we're on deep volcanic loam. We've got good water supply underneath us. We pump between us about 30 or 40 million litres of water from a deep aquifer, and we've got a little bit of surface water, although it's very difficult to build dams, as many of you might know, on that red soil. So we've been occupying it for 100 years, and we've sort of moved our crops to reflect the fact that we've got water now. We never did have irrigation water. No one had irrigation water up until 30, 40 years ago, but as you've heard, we grow about, at the moment, 5 or 6 acres of veg. We used to grow 30 acres of veg. We've sort of calmed down a little bit now. We've put in orchards and grow apples, chestnuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, and a few other mixed species of fruits. So we found ourselves about 40 years ago, I think, being surrounded by potato farmers, mainly by McCain's contract potato farmers. Of course, those spuds end up going into the McDonald's French fries, most of them. We found that we were faced with a prospect of either getting big or getting out. You know, that's the tragedy of industrial agriculture, of course. We decided we weren't going anywhere, and thought, well, let's change the way we do things. And so the first thing we needed to do, we figured, was to revegetate. It was a flat bit of ground. There were about 5 gum trees on it and half a dozen cypresses that my parents had planted, and it was pretty windswept. So we started off over a period of about 5 years or so planting windbreaks. We put in 2,000 or 3,000, 4,000 gum trees and wattles, etc. But we also planted a pretty hefty lot of deciduous trees. Quite a few hundred oak trees, quite a few hundred chestnuts, and a mixture of different deciduous trees, everything pretty much, maples and honey locusts. Many of those with the prospect of growing stock fodder, and I'll talk a bit about that later. So once we started the revegetation, I think we really felt then that we had an opportunity to push ahead, because we had shelter, we had microclimates that we could use for livestock, microclimates for growing orchards, microclimates for houses, buildings, microclimates for vegetable production. And I think that was the first step. I was very much inspired by Dr. Richard St Barb Baker, the man of the trees, who told us all that we had to do the planting. God wasn't going to plant them for us, we had to do it ourselves. So that's what we did. After we got the revegetation happening, I think the next step really was reorienting the farm. I mean, we still produce some of the same things that we produced 50 years ago, but it wasn't enough. And of course the prices were not enough either. So we went organic. We decided to convert to organic. We were pretty much organic in many respects. We never used any significant amount of inputs. I think my dad put out 1/3 of a bag of super to the acre over the whole time that he was farming. And I think he might have sprayed a little bit of DDT a couple of times, because back in those days when you were milking cows you know, you didn't want anything to eat that clover. And as soon as you saw a little bit of white on the clover, you know, everyone would rush out and spray DDT, of course, to kill the red-legged earth mite. Little did they know it was really a consequence of using a little bit of superphosphate, because it was also lush and tasty for the bugs. So basically it was a very clean farm. Not that you have to have a farm that's never used chemicals to become organic. I mean, under the rules you can go organic in 3 years. Doesn't matter really what you've been doing, unless you've totally pickled the place, and some people have. So we went organic, and we got ourselves certified, and that was when we started to realise that we really needed to, and I think Ben sort of alluded to it, integrate the systems on the farm. And what we've tried to do is integrate the trees with annual cropping with animals. So, and I've already mentioned how the trees provide us with shelter, but they also provide us with a fair bit of nutrient recycling, particularly the deciduous trees. A lot of leaf, we get a lot of leaf now, and that rots down and forms a really nice organic fertiliser. A bit unlike gum trees, which tend to sort of change the sort of soil, and it's a different chemistry, etc. But the deciduous trees are really important. I'm not suggesting that we've absolutely transformed our soil because of that, but in time I think that's one of the things that one does tend to see. In terms of the food that we produce out the other end of the organic system, I like Fred Kirschenman, who's an organic farmer from North Dakota. He says, organic farming is necessary, I'm paraphrasing him, it's necessary, it works, and the food that comes out the other end is really just a benevolent byproduct of the farming system. And in a sense, we were more interested, I was always more interested in how the system worked than what the actual food was that came out the other end, and there's plenty of it. We started off in our organic venture without a business plan, and the reason we didn't have a business plan was there was no market when we started. And I've always held the philosophy that business plans can get in the way of a good business, to be honest. But we built the farm up so quite incrementally. We really went step by step, and we started off with an acre or so of organic veg, and then we went to 5 and 10, and I think we peaked out at about 25 acres when we were selling products into the wholesale markets around Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. We used to produce about 10 tonne of broccoli, 100 tonne of carrots, 100 tonne of spuds, another 100 tonne of cabbages, and that's when we were sort of operating at our biggest. But it was a lot of hard work, and I don't think we really made as much money out of it as what we do now with a much reduced acreage. In fact, now we grow about 5 acres of veg, as I've said, out of the 100 acres that I currently have control of, and it seems plenty. It seems plenty to me. I've always inspired by the notion of food for people, not for profit. It's ironic that that was a bumper sticker that appeared on a friend of mine's car who owned a restaurant in Daylesford 40 years ago. And let me tell you, that ethic, the complete opposite, is at work in Daylesford today. I've been inspired too in this journey by a few people that I must mention, and one of them who I had the great pleasure of doing some workshops with quite a few years ago now was Mr. Fukuoka, the Japanese natural farmer. I think the thing that I learnt most of all from him was, if there's a way to make it easier, do it, because he really did sort of have very much a Zen approach to farming. And I think everyone needs to have a little bit of a Zen approach, because otherwise you can get yourself in an endless loop of incredibly hard work and you can burn yourself out. So Fukuoka helped me there, I think, but I was also inspired by other people who I had chances to do workshops with, of course, the Mollison Holmgren team, the latter of whom I'm still a very good friend of. Wes Jackson, the American agriculturalist who still works on breeding perennial plants, but his whole devotion to a perennial plant system is one that I greatly admire. Another one that Ben mentioned, at least in the holistic rangeland management area, Alan Savory, who I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with, working on how to increase animal productivity through rotational grazing and holistic management. And Jean Lodgson, one that doesn't often come up, but Jean wrote a terrific book many years ago, I'd say 40 years ago, called An Orchard of Trees to Live In. And I was quite inspired by that, and to this day, my house, my mud bricker, sits amidst a whole host of deciduous fruit and nut trees, of course, not only providing a beautiful scenario and a terrific lot of shelter, but in these days, and particularly where I come from, and many of you live in the same bushfire vulnerable areas, there's nothing more reassuring than having a canopy of deciduous trees envelop your living quarters. It's a great comfort when the temperature's 100 plus outside and the north wind's blowing to have that canopy to live under. And I think Jean Lodgson did a lot to inspire me in that direction. But I was probably more inspired just in general by the organic movement itself. As I said, we started off before there was really an industry, and I was very lucky to go and visit a lot of organic farms in the world, and certainly in Australia. But the idea of the farm as an organism, I think, was the key feature from organic philosophy. The farm as an organism, and that's why I sort of called my talk Occupying the Farm. It's not necessarily about us people occupying the farm, it's keeping the farm itself occupied. Occupying the farm in the sense that it fulfills a whole range of analogous ecological functions. The farm as an ecological organism, providing functional biodiversity, a farm that provides its own ecosystem services and ecosystem services off the farm, so often forgotten by contemporary agriculture, of course, which externalises many of those costs. And of course production. Underneath all of that, underneath it all, you need to have production. And I remember my father-in-law, who was an apple orchardist down on the Mornington Peninsula. He never had a great marketing plan. He never had a great public relations machine working behind him, but he grew the best damn apples that you could get down there, and he always did well because he had a good product that came out the end of his farm. So how do you get there with all these things? Well, I want to be a little bit practical now and talk a bit about some of the dimensions of the farm, and I'll probably start with water because we can't do much without water, whether it be stock and domestic water or whether it be irrigation water. Irrigation water really does open up the possibilities for expanding your farm enterprise, and when we expanded beyond stock and domestic, we had plenty of small bores around 100 feet deep for 50 or 80 years, and they were a bit ephemeral, you know. They all dried out in the drought. But once we joined most of our neighbours, too many of us unfortunately, in punching down a little deeper to 100 metres, we all discovered that we had a tremendous supply of aquifer water underneath us, and that's been a really incredible thing to have on a farm, and it allowed us to do irrigation. We use irrigation that's fairly sparing with water. I use a bit of overhead irrigation using some nice little Israeli designed portable sprinkler systems which run on 1.25" poly pipe connected to 2-inch mains. It's not too much heavy artillery. It's not like it's permanent. I can wrap the whole thing up and move 10 acres of irrigation in an afternoon to a completely new field. And that's important for me to be able to do. Very, very small investment. Also some trickle irrigation, which I can trickle irrigate about 5 acres. I think I spent a couple of $1,000 on pipe 20 years ago, and those pipes are still out there, they're still working. I've driven over them, we've worked, we have to fix a few of them up every year, but they've been very resilient. So that irrigation system has made it really our repertoire of production. Soil and soil fertility. Well, we've been blessed with the gift of good land where I live, and but nonetheless, those basalt soils, some of you might have those. I know it's not an area, it's not well known in this district, but they still needed some work. Their innate fertility is not that high. I think our phosphorus levels only were ever about 4 parts per million, and with the addition of fertiliser we've got them up a bit higher, but not too much higher. Our base organic matter was about 6%, and that's an important percentage because, and I'm sort of going here a little bit on hearsay, but I remember old Chuck Walters, the father of Acres USA, said to me once, he said, "You need 5%, fella. You need 5% organic matter before you start to get the soil nutrition cycling, before you start to see biological processes kick in that liberate whatever minerals that might be there and liberate whatever minerals you might like to add." But we certainly did some mineralisation. We did some soil testing. I don't take soil tests 100% as gospel, but particularly phosphorus tests. They're all over the place. But we added a little bit of rock phosphate, probably about 1/2 a tonne to the acre. We added limestone, crushed limestone, and most farms will handle a bit of limestone and a bit of rock phosphate, unless you happen to live on the beach somewhere down near South Australia. And I'd say around here that would probably be a reasonable sort of a formula. And a few trace elements, a bit of molybdenum, a little bit of manganese, a little bit of boron out in the orchard and the nuts, but like, you know, a cupful, hardly any. And we've never had to do it again. In fact, we haven't really put much fertiliser out for the last 10 or 15 years since we've got that cycle moving and since we got our basic mineral levels up to a reasonable level. We rely pretty much on fertility with the livestock moving through the system, a bit like Ben mentioned. We use cattle and sheep pretty much. We've got my brother's on the same farm, he's got a couple of 100 chooks, but we usually mainly sheep and cattle, and we move them around in a rotation, but then we move the vegetable farming around in that rotation. We usually farm veggies for a couple of years, preceded by about 6 or 8 years or so of livestock, and in the last year or so of livestock they get fed fairly heavily on the paddocks that are about to become vegetable farming. So usually you've got a pretty good cover of cow manure. And sheep, we do a bit of pasture harrowing though, which old Alex Podolinsky always reckons is an important thing to do, and I'll go along with him on that, to pasture harrow the dung, even though we've got dung beetles all over the place doing it for us as well. And cultivation-wise, well, we do some cultivation, obviously. I mean, Fukuoka had it down pretty pat, but I'm afraid I've had to use a moldboard plough in plenty of cases. In fact, that's what we use. Even though some of the purists in the land management field say, oh, you should never cultivate, we find that moldboard plough is a very simple and very smooth, very low energy way to get a seed bed ready for planting veggies. And that means turning the soil over. And of course, like many farms, we've got a bit of bent grass in there, and it's great to bury those grasses and start out with a nice fresh surface, and then a little bit of yeoman's plough tillage through that to get a bit more depth in the soil. So we cultivate probably the top 12 inches or so of soil, and we use a power harrow to provide us with seed beds and moulded raised beds for growing our crops on. We sort of practice a kind of precision agriculture, I suppose, when it comes to vegetable production. Everything's laid out on a grid. Our beds are always a standard size, 60-inch wheel tracks on tractors, beds with vegetables planted at the same distance so that we can manage them with some devices, which I'll talk about in a minute, for weed control. Then we move through pests and diseases. Well, what I've discovered as an organic farmer, and what I've seen on most organic farms, which I've visited many of, is that insect pests are not really much of a problem. And I think the main reason that they're not much of a problem is we don't spray. That's my sincere belief. If you keep some sort of an insect ecology in place, you find that there's never really any rampant insect pests. However, having said that, there's a few that we really do have to watch out for. And the main insect pests that we deal with are the caterpillars, the Lepidoptera. And there's a few of them out there. For example, we've got vine moths will get stuck into the grapevines. Codlin moth, the caterpillar, gets into the apples. Potato grub, another caterpillar, gets into the spuds. Army worm, another caterpillar, will sometimes nip the tops off the oats. White cabbage butterfly, another caterpillar, gets into the brassica. Diamondback moth, another caterpillar. All caterpillars, they'll get into your brassica crops. And there's probably a few other caterpillars out there at work that I don't even know about. We've had entomologists work with us over the years. It's been a fair while now, but we had Paul Horn, who comes from down this way, Integrated Pest Management Technologies, great entomologist. He came out for a year or so, and we were interested to see what was actually happening with our pests, in particular our caterpillars. And so he monitored carefully, set little traps. He'd bring back caterpillars to the lab and catch them with vacuum cleaners and all that sort of stuff. And we discovered that 90% of our caterpillars were being parasitised on the farm by 3 different wasp species, some of which had been introduced years ago, some of which were probably local wasps. Tiny wasps, little wasps, trichogrammas, you can't see them, like they're so small. And they were doing most of the work for us, and the reason they were working so well was we weren't spraying anything, so that was great. But we still had to use a couple of products, one product in particular, which was BT. Many of you have heard of it, but a bit of Bacillus thuringiensis, which is quite allowable under the organic standards, a naturally occurring bacteria, a little puff of that here and there, and basically our caterpillar problems are non-existent, and as a consequence our insect pest problems are virtually non-existent. So the big pests, if you want, are the birds. We grow walnuts and we grow fruit, and the birds, and we've got cockatoos everywhere, and crows, black ravens everywhere, but we've pretty much licked those with a bird guard, bird scarer. A bit noisy in the suburbs, but if you live more than probably 500 metres or so from your nearest neighbour, for a couple of grand, they're enormously expensive. You're cheaper to go to California and buy one than to buy one from Queensland. But if you go and get one and plug it in, it's a bit screechy, but it works. It keeps 90% of the bird damage at bay. And so after years of whinging, everywhere you went, you know, the bloody birds are eating everything. After years of that, the birds now, even though they're everywhere, it looks like you're being attacked, it works and you get your product. We get all of our crops. We might lose 10% instead of 90%. Weeds. Weeds are probably one of the biggest issues that we have. I think that's how I'm standing in that photograph there. But this little device here is a device that was introduced to me by Elliot Coleman at a workshop that he did at my farm about 30 years ago. This is an oscillating hoe, and as the name suggests, it's got a little sort of swivel top on it, and you can weed your veggies with this going back and forward. And honestly, the simplicity of this little gadget means that you can turn what is an absolutely daunting hand weeding exercise into a short period of quite enjoyable activity, because it's got a nice long handle shaped out of a cypress branch, and if you really want, you can get the branch to suit your own ergonomic structure. And one of these you can weed 5 acres. One person. I've never done the 5, I've always had too many other things to do, but one of these really allows you to scoot along. It's a precision garden weeder, and they're sold by Ulsan Farms in Gundaroo. which is up near ACT, mail order. You buy that little gadget, it's about $50. But it's a great investment, and it beats by a mile those kind of pronged hoe sort of weeders that we've all grown up with. All they do is more or less stimulate the weeds, I reckon, whereas these slice them off with minimal effort. But weeds really are probably one of the challenges that we've had, and it's more than just cutting them out. You have to sort of manage weeds in a long-term basis. So what we do, for example, is we use livestock to eat grass and weeds, but we try and get them to eat before they set seed. So if you can reduce the amount of seeding that goes on, you can reduce the seed bank that comes back to, haunt you for years after those seeds set. Fertility is another issue about weeds. And of course, then you've got the whole philosophical thing about what is a weed, and I won't go there. Fertility is important. Having good fertility means that your desirable plants, in particular in pasture, so for example clovers and ryegrasses and things, will grow and outcompete the bent grass. If your soil is low in phosphorus and low in calcium and a bit sour, the bent grass and other things, they do really well. So you can manipulate weeds with fertility. But we also use, and going back to the precision growing thing, which you can operate at a very small level, we also use a fantastic device that was built and designed by a local farmer who now practices in the commercial weed market. Michael Fix is his name, and he makes the Fix Weeder, the fleets of Fix Weeders, which are devices that sit on your tractors, and you can probably weed 95% of your weeds out of your row crops using one of Michael Fix's Fix Weeders. And if you look for Fix Weeder on the web, you'll see what I mean. They're the gadgets that we like to have. 5 minutes, thank you. Livestock. Well, I mentioned a little bit about livestock. It's a tricky one these days because, we've always run livestock, and we're very mindful these days of the whole process of enteric fermentation, and that is the amount of methane that these friends of ours sort of contribute. In fact, it's much bigger than the whole transport and fossil fuel energy thing, is the amount of methane our animals put out. But I'm not convinced that we can't ameliorate that with the grazing management that we practice. It makes it tough in a drought when you haven't got sort of really good cycling of nutrients and good growth. But I think with a bit of decent management and growing your pastures up and then knocking them back down again and growing them up, that we can fix a lot of the atmospheric carbon that is being sort of disrupted. Well, it's methane they're putting out, but we can still come up with some balance. I think the jury's out a bit on the livestock role. The work of Professor Peter Quinn from the University of Armidale, he's doing some fascinating work on modelling methane cycles in soil and animals. Really good stuff. But anyway, we run the livestock. They're great for fertility, great for weed management. And of course, we don't use any synthetic nitrogen, so animal dung is pretty important. And of course, we have to keep the animals healthy. Mainly that's through giving them good feed. We kept busy with fencing, but that's life. And as I also mentioned, fodder trees are important for us. Oaks, we've got a few hundred oaks, and my sheep have been living off acorns for the last 6 or 8, 10 weeks. Chestnuts, the ones I don't pick, and that's most of them these days, they're only worth $3. The sheep can extract every chestnut out of every husk. Tree lucerne, or Tagesasti, another important fodder tree, and honey locust. All of them add up to a really handy fodder for our livestock. We make a lot of fodder out of grass, but they're important. Talking about direct sales now, I'm moving on quickly here. We sell our products now in box scheme, our vegetable products. Used to sell them on the market, but now we've sort of gone back to selling them direct to customers. We do up to 200 boxes a week. We're just finishing up right now, as a matter of fact. There's no advertising required. There's no one in between us and the customer. We don't buy new packaging. We do minimal amount of grading, a minimal amount of cleaning, and we sell products, organic products that are affordable. In fact, our organic products are cheaper than anything you'll buy conventionally in a supermarket, and we still make good money out of it. I think the box scheme, I've often wondered about the box scheme, you know, whether it's going to endure and whether we'll continue with it. And I think it will, because every year I sort of try and stop doing it and I get more demand, so I keep doing it. But there's more people doing it, and the beauty of the box scheme, where you put in perhaps 10 or 15 different veggie, fruit products in a box and sell it, is that anyone can do it. It's something that allows for decentralised production at any scale. You might only do 5 boxes, you might do 5,000. I think that the model is one that's probably got some durability. There's more competition out there, but hey, that's good. Labour requirements, I was just going to say briefly that my dad was an only child, and he learnt how to run the 200-acre farm by himself and with 8 horses. And then he moved on, he had a tractor and a ute. But still he learnt how to do everything by himself. You know, you'd always minimise the amount of work that you'd do to make something happen. And I've sort of taken on some of that. We don't employ much labour. We do most of it ourselves. I get some woofers in over the summer, but they're not a silver bullet either, you know. It's a great experience. We like having them. They enjoy it. Takes a bit to train them, but it is good. But I was interested to read a review of a book that's just come out called The Shepherd's Life, A Tale of the Lake Districts by James Rebank, and he says, landscapes like ours are the sum total and cumulation of a million little unseen jobs. So that's the story, guys. A lot of the stuff you do on the farm, no one will ever see it. No one will ever notice you. No one will ever recognise a lot of the work that you've done, but it gets done and you have to do it. Very briefly, energy is an issue that we've dealt with somewhat. We still use some diesel. We've cut back a lot on it. We've got some wind energy. We've got some solar energy. We've been off the grid for 30 years. Now, with the farming families around us, the 2 brothers, we've got some synergy. We share equipment. We share a bit of livestock management. And then they've got restaurants and chooks and vineyards, so we sort of get some synergy there. We've just recently got a tiny house project up, planning to do more for farm visits, stays and residency. And then finally, resilience. I think that's the 3 R's, being able to respond to perturbations in the circumstances, climatically, economically. I mean, it's getting drier in central Victoria, and the way it's looking, it's going to just keep getting drier. So we've got to work towards harvesting, conserving water, more deep-rooted vegetation, more tree crops, and lucerne is important. Managing our groundwater, getting involved with groundwater management, because there are those that want to go and use it all today and forget about what it's going to be like tomorrow. And income diversification, that's been important for us. We've never got rich, but we've always had pretty reasonable years because of the diversification across all those crops. So it's kept us busy doing all this, keeps us quite busy, but that's probably been a good thing. I just got to get home in time to feed the cows. Thank you.